Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Missouri. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In April 1882, the small hamlet of Millerton in rural Pike County, Missouri, became the unwitting stage for a mystery that would haunt the region for generations. The morning of April 17th dawned crisp and clear as residents noticed that Frederick Hauser, the reliable German immigrant who had operated the town's only general store for nearly 15 years, had failed to open his doors for the third consecutive day. This absence was particularly notable as Hauser was known throughout Pike County for his rigid punctuality, opening precisely at 7 each morning except Sundays. When Jacob Miller and Thomas Whitfield, concerned neighbors whose farms adjoined Hauser's property, ventured to investigate, they discovered the store unlocked, a half-written ledger entry dated April 14th still open on the counter, and a cup of coffee long gone cold beside it. Nothing appeared disturbed within the meticulously organized establishment. The cash box remained in its place beneath the counter, containing $23.47 according to Miller's subsequent statement to the Pike County Sheriff. Hauser's living quarters behind the shop showed no signs of packing or preparation for travel. His Sunday suit still hung by the bedroom door, and a partially prepared meal sat preserved in the cool spring air that filtered through the open kitchen window. This seemingly mundane discovery would eventually lead authorities down a path so dark that initial newspaper accounts described it only as an unexplained disappearance of local merchant. The Pike County Register noted on April 25th that a thorough search of the surrounding countryside had been conducted without result, concluding that Mr. Hauser may have departed to attend to unknown business elsewhere. The brevity of this account belied the horror that had actually transpired, a truth that would remain buried for 42 years, until a chance discovery in 1924, when the abandoned Hauser property was purchased by the Wilson family. What they found beneath the worn floorboards of the cellar during renovations would finally illuminate the darkness that had settled over Millerton in that fateful spring, revealing secrets that some in the community had suspected, but none had dared articulate. Frederick Hauser had been a fixture in Millerton since 1877, when the German immigrant purchased the general store from its aging proprietor William Fenton for what locals considered a generous sum. County records preserved in the Pike County Courthouse described him as industrious, particular in his dealings, and of reserved disposition. His neat handwriting filled town records as he served as unofficial clerk for local meetings, his penmanship distinctive with its precise Germanic flourishes that demonstrated both his foreign education and meticulous nature. Neighbors interviewed during the subsequent investigation recalled him as unfailingly polite, though somewhat distant, a bachelor who seemed devoted to his business and to his correspondence with distant relatives in Bavaria. Hauser spoke English with only a slight accent, having reportedly spent several years in Philadelphia before moving westward. The store he maintained served as the commercial and social hub for the scattered farms surrounding Millerton, a place where news was exchanged alongside goods, where politics were debated by the pot-bellied stove during winter months, and where community notices were posted in the large front window. Hauser kept meticulous inventory, ordering specialty goods for loyal customers from suppliers in St. Louis and extending credit during poor harvests, a practice that earned him considerable goodwill. His ledgers, later recovered by investigators, revealed a methodical mind and thriving business, with transactions recorded in flawless columns of figures that never required correction. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, subtle inconsistencies would later trouble investigators reviewing the case. Martha Jenkins, who cleaned the store once weekly, noted in her 1924 statement that Hauser forbade entry to the cellar storage area, insisting on carrying goods up and down himself despite his slender build. Bank records showed that a man with such modest living requirements inexplicably withdrew significant funds from the Millerton Bank every third month, approximately $200 each time, with no corresponding business expenses recorded in his meticulous ledgers. Most puzzling was the discovery of a second set of accounts hidden beneath the floorboards of his private quarters, documenting transactions with individuals whose names appeared nowhere in town or county records. Perhaps most disturbing were reports from local hunters that their dogs consistently refused to approach the storage cellar behind his store, growing agitated and whimpering when brought near the sturdy door that Hauser had reinforced with unusual iron brackets shortly after taking ownership. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore's preliminary investigation into Hauser's disappearance yielded few insights, despite his reputation for thoroughness that had previously solved 2 murder cases in neighboring Warren County. The store contained no signs of struggle or forced entry, with merchandise still neatly arranged on shelves and the cash drawer containing the previous day's earnings exactly as recorded in the ledger. Hauser's chestnut mare remained in its stable behind the store, well fed and groomed, its feed bin filled with enough oats to last several days. The lawman noted in his official report that this alone suggested no planned journey, as Hauser was known to be particularly devoted to the animal. His modest rooms above the store appeared undisturbed, clothing still hanging in wardrobes, personal effects neatly arranged on bureaus, and his prized collection of German literature untouched on their shelves. The sheriff documented with particular attention that the bed had been made with hospital corners, suggesting Hauser had risen normally that morning and followed his usual habits. The only unusual elements discovered during the thorough search were a recently received letter from Germany torn into fragments in the waste paper basket beside his writing desk, and a leather-bound book written entirely in German script hidden beneath Hauser's mattress, its contents indecipherable to the monolingual sheriff and his deputies. Whitmore's investigation extended to interviews with every resident of Millerton and surrounding farms, yet these conversations revealed nothing remarkable about Hauser's behavior in the days before his disappearance. His ledger showed routine transactions with regular customers, and all reported their interactions as unremarkable. His last known interaction had been with Sarah Everton, who purchased flour and sugar late Tuesday afternoon before returning to her farm 3 miles north of town. She described Hauser as perhaps more distracted than usual but otherwise normal in his dealings, noting that he had twice miscounted her change before correcting himself with an apology. A search of the surrounding countryside by volunteers yielded no trace of the missing shopkeeper, no disturbed earth that might indicate foul play, no torn clothing caught on brambles or fence posts. The sheriff's report, filed the 17th of April, 1882, concluded that Hauser had likely departed voluntarily and perhaps returning to Germany in haste due to family matters as suggested by the torn correspondence. The case was effectively closed within the week, and Millerton gradually adjusted to the shopkeeper's absence with the resilience common to frontier communities accustomed to the transient nature of settlement. The store remained shuttered for 3 months before being purchased by newcomer Albert Collins, a former railroad man from Illinois who found the ready-made business opportunity irresistible, despite local whispers about its former proprietor's mysterious fate. What the official report failed to capture were the subtle oddities that surrounded Hauser's tenure in Millerton, peculiarities that townsfolk had noticed but rarely discussed openly until the later investigation. Martha Blackwood, whose family operated the town's only boarding house, was interviewed in 1925 when investigations resumed following the cellar discovery. She recalled that despite operating the town's main store for 5 years and interacting daily with locals, Hauser seemed strangely unintegrated into community life. He attended church functions and town meetings, but always seemed to be observing rather than participating, she noted in her sworn statement. His smile never quite reached his eyes, and he would watch conversations more than contribute to them. There was always something calculating in his gaze, as though he were assessing rather than connecting with his neighbors. When children ran through his store, he would grow noticeably tense, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his pencil or counter edge until they departed. Local farmer James Whitaker, whose property bordered the western edge of town, mentioned during the reopened investigation that several travelers who had planned to stay at the small rooms Hauser rented above his store had changed their plans after meeting him, preferring to continue their journeys despite approaching darkness or threatening weather. Something about the man just set folks on edge after a while, Whitaker stated in his formal testimony. Cannot rightly explain it, but animals seemed to feel it too. My dog would growl something fierce whenever we approached the store, and no amount of scolding would quiet him. Even my horses seemed reluctant to be hitched outside Hauser's establishment, stamping and snorting until our business was concluded. Most disturbing were the recollections of 3 children who had played near Hauser's property during the summer of 1881. 10-year-old William Peterson, his sister Emma, and their cousin George Harper reported hearing strange sounds emanating from the cellar behind the store late at night while retrieving a ball that had rolled behind the building. William described it as like someone crying, but trying not to be heard, while Emma insisted it sounded more like singing in a language she did not recognize. When they told their parents about the unsettling experience, they were forbidden from playing near the store again and instructed not to spread tales that might damage the reputation of a respected businessman. These accounts, dismissed in 1882 as childish imagination or attempts to explain away trespassing, would gain sinister significance in light of later discoveries that would transform Hauser from respected merchant to something far more disturbing in the collective memory of Pike County. In November 1924, Albert Collins, who had purchased Hauser's store and operated it successfully for over 4 decades, decided to expand his storage facilities to accommodate the growing inventory demands of the modernizing community. The original cellar, with its low ceiling and perpetual dampness, had become inadequate for storing the canned goods and textiles that now comprised much of his business. Workers excavating behind the store to enlarge the old cellar made a chilling discovery on the morning of November 12th, their shovels striking something solid approximately 3 feet below the surface. The sound of metal against wood prompted Henry Givens, the lead worker, to clear away the surrounding soil, revealing the corner of a wooden crate approximately 6 feet in length. Assuming they had disturbed an unmarked grave from some forgotten burial, the workers immediately ceased their digging and notified Collins, who arrived breathless from his nearby home. Upon seeing the partially exposed container, Collins reportedly whispered, "Dear God in heaven," before sending his son to fetch Sheriff Robert Ealing from his office in the county courthouse. The sheriff arrived within the hour, bringing with him Dr. William Hayes, the county physician, anticipating the need for official documentation of human remains. The crate, constructed of seasoned oak with dovetailed corners and sealed with pitch, suggested careful craftsmanship far beyond what would be expected for a typical burial container of the period. The precision of its construction implied both skill and a disturbing amount of forethought. When opened under the watchful eyes of the gathered officials and an increasingly large crowd of townspeople, it did not contain a body as expected, but rather a collection of objects meticulously arranged within its confines, preserved remarkably well in the dry, sealed environment. Inside lay a leather ledger bound in calfskin with brass fittings, its pages filled with handwritten German script interspersed with precise anatomical drawings. Beside it rested a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, their paper yellowed but still legible, addressed to various individuals across Missouri and neighboring states. More disturbing were several articles of women's clothing, including 5 distinct dresses of varying sizes, each neatly folded and separated by tissue paper, showing no signs of decay despite their years underground. A collection of personal effects occupied one corner of the casket, hairbrushes with strands still caught in the bristles, pocket watches of varying quality, wedding rings and lockets containing miniature portraits of strangers, and several pairs of eyeglasses. Most alarming was a set of surgical instruments showing evidence of extensive use, their once bright surfaces darkened with what appeared to be dried blood that had never been properly cleaned away. A photograph taken by the sheriff's office shows these items laid out on the grass behind Collins' store, their significance not yet understood, the darkness they represented still concealed beneath the bright autumn sunshine of that fateful November day. The ledger found within the buried crate contained entries spanning from 1,875 to 1,882, written in a precise hand that was identified as Frederick Hauser's through comparison with store records and town documents he had maintained as unofficial clerk. Bound in dark calfskin with reinforced corners and a curious symbol embossed on its cover, the book contained 212 pages of densely written text. Unlike his business accounts, these entries were coded, utilizing a sophisticated substitution cipher that initially confounded investigators despite their best efforts. After local attempts at decryption failed, Sheriff Ealing contacted Dr. Lawrence Mitchell, a professor of linguistics from the University of Missouri who had previously assisted with translating documents in a Street Louis murder case. The professor worked methodically for 6 weeks, eventually deciphering the system through a breakthrough when he recognized references to anatomical terms from his university's medical texts. The decoded contents proved so disturbing that Sheriff Ealing initially restricted access to the document, allowing only essential personnel involved in the investigation to review its pages. According to police reports filed in December 1924, the decoded entries revealed that Frederick Hauser was an assumed identity crafted with meticulous attention to detail. The man's real name was Anton Kellerman, formerly a medical student at the University of Heidelberg who had fled Germany in 1874 after being implicated in the disappearance of several young women from the surrounding countryside. The ledger contained methodical records of at least 17 individuals who had vanished while passing through Millerton during his tenure as shopkeeper, each entry providing detailed physical descriptions, personal histories gleaned through careful conversation, and clinical descriptions of their procedures and contributions to medical understanding. Kellerman had specifically targeted travelers unlikely to be missed immediately, noting in one entry that isolation creates opportunity for advancement of knowledge otherwise denied to scientific inquiry by societal weakness. Most chilling was Kellerman's dispassionate tone throughout the document, discussing human dissection with the detachment of a botanist cataloging specimens. He recorded detailed observations about organ weights, tissue structures, and the effects of various chemical compounds on living subjects, occasionally referencing earlier experiments for comparison. Anatomical sketches accompanied many entries, rendered with artistic skill that testified to his formal medical training. The final entry, dated the 12th of April 1882, 2 days before his disappearance, mentioned unacceptable risk of discovery, following the unexplained interest of several local children in the cellar operations and preparations for relocation complete. The darkness that had operated undetected in Millerton had not ended with the discovery of the crate, but merely moved elsewhere to continue what Kellerman described as his contribution to advancing medical science beyond the artificial constraints of ethics. Following the discovery of the ledger, Sheriff Ealing ordered a complete excavation of the cellar and surrounding grounds, bringing in additional deputies from neighboring counties and securing the site from the growing number of curious onlookers. What they uncovered during the 3-week excavation exceeded even the worst expectations suggested by the coded journal. Beneath the seemingly ordinary dirt floor of the original cellar, workers discovered a carefully concealed trapdoor, its edges sealed with wax to prevent the escape of revealing odors. This door opened to a hidden chamber approximately 15 feet square, excavated an additional 8 feet below the main cellar, its walls reinforced with brick and timber salvaged from abandoned structures outside town. The chamber contained a nightmarish collection, its walls lined with rough wooden shelves supporting dozens of glass jars, each meticulously labeled in the same precise handwriting found in the ledger. The contents of these jars, human organs preserved in alcohol, including hearts, kidneys, livers, and sections of brain, provided grim confirmation of Kellerman's activities described in his journal. According to the official inventory completed by Dr. Hayes and filed with the county clerk on December 3, 1924, the collection contained specimens from at least 20 different individuals, each labeled with dates corresponding to entries in the recovered ledger. More disturbing still were the human remains recovered from the soil around the property once the investigation expanded beyond the cellar itself. Careful excavation revealed bone fragments and partial skeletons buried at irregular intervals within 50 yards of the store building, concentrated particularly along the northern property line, where dense shrubbery had provided visual screening from neighboring properties. Forensic examination conducted by Dr. William Hadley, who traveled from St. Louis at the governor's request, indicated at least 12 individuals had been buried there over time, their bones showing precise cuts consistent with anatomical dissection performed with professional skill. Dr. Hadley noted in his official report that the precision demonstrated in the dissections suggested extensive medical training, consistent with Kellerman's background as a former medical student. The excavation also yielded a second hidden chamber connected to the first by a narrow passage, smaller than the main room, but more deliberately constructed, containing a heavy oak table fitted with leather restraints, additional surgical instruments of higher quality than those found in the buried crate, and a crude but effective drainage system that channeled fluids into a deep pit filled with lime. Residue analysis indicated extensive blood stains on the walls and floor, with splatter patterns suggesting the victims had been conscious and struggling during at least portions of their ordeals. What had once been dismissed as an eccentric shopkeeper's storage cellar was revealed as something far more sinister, a private laboratory where Kellerman had conducted his grim experiments for years, undetected in the heart of the small community. The bundle of letters recovered from the buried crate provided further insight into Kellerman's disturbed mind, their yellowed pages filled with the same meticulous handwriting found in the ledger, but written in conventional German rather than cipher. Addressed to a Professor Heinrich Weber at the University of Heidelberg but never sent, they outlined Kellerman's research in clinical detail, describing his techniques for selection of subjects, methods of examination, and conclusions drawn from his work spanning the period from his arrival in America to approximately 1 month before his disappearance from Millerton. The correspondence revealed an intellect utterly divorced from moral constraint, viewing human beings as merely materials for study, their pain and suffering reduced to clinical observations, noted with the same detachment one might record changes in weather. In one particularly disturbing passage, dated October 1879, Kellerman wrote, "I have determined that the application of electrical current to specific nerve clusters produces fascinating results that contradict established theories of neurological response." The female subject remained conscious for 17 minutes longer than anticipated, allowing for extensive documentation of progressive system failure. More troubling than these accounts of methodical cruelty was evidence that Kellerman's activities in Germany had not been conducted alone. References throughout the correspondence to our work and the Brotherhood suggested an association with like-minded individuals who shared his morbid interests and possibly his disregard for human life. Several passages indicated ongoing indirect communication with other members of this undefined group, with Kellerman noting in an 1878 letter, "Our scattered brotherhood continues its investigations on 3 continents, though I remain convinced that my methodologies will ultimately prove superior." The final letter, dated March 1882, indicated that Kellerman believed he was being pursued, not by law enforcement, but by former associates who disapproved of his independent research directions and the risks his activities posed to their collective security. "I suspect Wilhelm has betrayed my location," he wrote. "Twice this month I observed a man watching the store whose manner suggests purpose rather than casual interest." Professor Weber, when contacted by Missouri authorities through diplomatic channels, expressed horror at the contents of the letters and the activities they described. He confirmed that Anton Kellerman had indeed been his student from 1872 to 1874, but had been expelled from the university after exhibiting concerning fixations and unacceptable research proposals regarding pain response in cell paws, human subjects. Weber's written statement, preserved in the case files and translated by Dr. Mitchell, denied any knowledge of Kellerman's activities after his dismissal and condemned in the strongest terms the monstrous perversion of medical science described in the recovered letters, calling it an abomination against both human dignity and the principles of ethical, scientific inquiry. The grim task of identifying Kellerman's victims began in earnest in early 1925. A process that would bring closure to families across 3 states while opening old wounds long scarred over by time. Sheriff Ealing, working with law enforcement officials from neighboring counties and the state police, compiled records of missing persons reported between 1877 and 1882, creating a comprehensive registry of the disappeared whose journeys might have taken them through Pike County. The detailed descriptions in Kellerman's ledger proved cruelly useful, allowing investigators to match his clinical notes with reports of the missing, his meticulous documentation of physical characteristics, personal belongings, and biographical details serving in death the opposite purpose for which they had been recorded. Among those identified were Sarah Kellerman, 26, a schoolteacher traveling to take up a position in Street; Louis, whose disappearance had prompted only limited inquiry due to assumptions she had simply changed her plans; Thomas and Mary Woodford, a young couple journeying to visit family in Kansas City whose abandoned wagon had been discovered 10 miles west of Millerton in 1880, their disappearance attributed to possible bandit activity; Jonathan Miller, a cattle buyer known to carry substantial sums who had been presumed a victim of robbery on the isolated roads of rural Missouri; and perhaps most heartbreaking, Eliza Thompson, 19, whose disappearance while traveling to her wedding in Springfield had been the subject of an extensive but fruitless search in 1879, and her fiancé continuing to post reward notices for information until his own death from pneumonia 2 years later. The photograph of Eliza found among Kellerman's possessions, showing her smiling in anticipation of her future, became the public face of the case, reproduced in newspapers across the Midwest. In total, 14 of the 17 victims mentioned in the ledger were eventually identified through the painstaking cross-referencing of physical descriptions, dates of disappearance, and personal effects cataloged in Kellerman's records and recovered from his collection. The pattern that emerged was consistent and revealing. All were travelers passing through Millerton, individuals unlikely to be immediately missed in the community, people whose connections lay elsewhere. Most had stayed at the rooms Hauser rented above his store, or taken meals there, their last known location before vanishing from the world. The methodical selection of victims explained how Kellerman had operated undetected for so long in the small community. He had preyed not on locals whose disappearance would raise immediate alarm, but on transients whose absence might never be connected to their passage through Millerton. This strategy, investigators noted, demonstrated not only Kellerman's murderous nature, but his calculating intelligence and understanding of the social dynamics that would enable his activities to continue undetected. Kellerman's background and research interests became the subject of intensive investigation following the discoveries at the Millerton store, with authorities seeking to understand the mind behind such calculated horrors. Records obtained from the University of Heidelberg through diplomatic channels confirmed his enrollment as a medical student from 1872 to 1874, where he had initially shown considerable promise in anatomical studies and surgical technique. His academic records, translated and included in the case file, revealed a brilliant but increasingly troubled mind, with professors noting his excessive interest in nervous system response to extreme stimuli and concerning disregard for established ethical boundaries in research methodology. His dismissal followed an incident in the University Anatomical Theater where he was discovered conducting unauthorized procedures on cadavers, focusing particularly on the brain and spinal column. Dr. Howard Richards, a psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins University who reviewed the case materials in 1925 at the request of Missouri authorities, suggested in his 20-page analysis that Kellerman represented an unusual category of killer one, motivated neither by emotion nor financial gain, but by a perverted scientific curiosity that operated entirely outside moral constraints. The detailed ledger entries showed a clear progression from relatively simple dissections in his early victims to increasingly complex experiments involving the central nervous system and pain response thresholds in later subjects. Richards noted that Kellerman's later entries displayed growing disappointment with his findings, frequently referring to inconclusive results and inconsistent data patterns, suggesting that whatever knowledge he sought continued to elude him despite the mounting death toll. driving him to more extensive and horrific experiments in pursuit of his undefined breakthrough. The psychiatrist observed that Kellerman's journals contained no expressions of remorse, no acknowledgement of the humanity of his victims, and no indication he recognized any moral dimension to his actions. Most chilling was Richard's conclusion that Kellerman likely viewed himself not as a murderer, but as a pioneering researcher pushing beyond artificial constraints, his victims mere obstacles to scientific understanding, no different from laboratory animals. This complete psychological detachment, Richard suggested in his final assessment, explained the clinical precision of both his methods and his documentation, noting that the most dangerous predators are those who operate without passion, guided by intellectual frameworks that justify atrocity through appeals to higher purpose. The darkness in Millerton had worn the mask of rational inquiry and scientific method, cloaked in the respectability of German education and the unassuming demeanor of a small-town shopkeeper, making it all the more difficult to detect among neighbors who could not conceive of such methodical evil operating in their midst, serving them across a store counter each day with meticulous courtesy. As investigators pieced together Kellerman's crimes, the question of his own fate remained unanswered, a lingering shadow that continued to trouble those involved in the case. His sudden disappearance in April 1882 had originally been attributed to a voluntary departure, perhaps due to financial difficulties or personal matters, but the evidence in the buried crate suggested a different and more disturbing possibility. The final ledger entries mention of unacceptable risk and preparations for relocation complete, combined with a torn letter from Germany found in his quarters, indicated that Kellerman believed himself in danger from some external threat, possibly connected to the mysterious brotherhood referenced in his correspondence. The thoroughness with which he had concealed evidence of his activities before departing suggested both premeditation and an intention to eventually return, circumstances contradicted by his permanent absence. Inquiries through international law enforcement channels, conducted with the assistance of the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, produced no record of Anton Kellerman or Friedrich Hauser returning to Germany or entering any European country after 1882. A methodical search of passenger manifests from every major port city revealed no names matching either identity or any physical description resembling the shopkeeper. Circulars distributed to police departments throughout the Midwest and beyond, containing Hauser's photograph from the Millerton town records and details of his crimes, generated numerous reports of similar men but no confirmed sightings. A thorough cross-reference of missing persons and unidentified remains throughout the Midwest similarly yielded no potential matches for a man of his age, build, and distinctive features. It was as if the man had simply vanished, taking his darkness elsewhere, or perhaps meeting his end through means that left no discoverable trace, becoming as anonymous in death as his victims had been in his ledgers. Several theories emerged during the investigation, each unsettling in its implications. Some suggested that members of the Brotherhood had located Kellerman and eliminated him as a liability to their collective secrecy. Others proposed that he had successfully established yet another identity, becoming someone new in a different community, perhaps continuing his grim work under a fresh facade of respectability. Most disturbing was the possibility raised by Dr. Richards that Kellerman, recognizing the increasing risk in Millerton, had simply moved his operation to another isolated location, selecting a new community with the same calculated care he had shown in choosing his victims. Sheriff Ealing's final report, dated March 1925, concluded that Kellerman had most likely established a new identity elsewhere, possibly continuing his activities in another isolated community whose residents, like those of Millerton, would never suspect the darkness living among them. The report recommended alerting all law enforcement agencies to the case and the potential for similar discoveries in small towns across America. The darkness that had infected Millerton might now be operating elsewhere, undetected and unnamed, waiting for another chance discovery to bring its horrors to light. References in Kellerman's letters to the Brotherhood prompted a wider investigation that uncovered disturbing connections reaching far beyond the isolated horrors of Millerton, suggesting a darkness more organized and pervasive than initially suspected. Professor Weber, when pressed for additional information through increasingly urgent diplomatic channels, reluctantly revealed that during Kellerman's time at Heidelberg, rumors had circulated among faculty about a secret society among certain medical students dedicated to research unrestricted by conventional morality or ethical constraints. University authorities had investigated these rumors in 1873, but found insufficient evidence for formal action, despite discovering anatomical drawings of disturbing precision in a private meeting room used by the suspected group. Several students suspected of involvement, including Kellerman, had subsequently been dismissed for other violations of academic standards, ranging from unauthorized use of university facilities to theft of medical specimens. Weber, visibly troubled even in the formal language of his written statement, provided the names of 5 former students who had been part of this group, 3 of whom had subsequently disappeared from official records after leaving the university, their subsequent activities and whereabouts unknown. American authorities, working with their European counterparts through newly established international police cooperation protocols, tracked one of these individuals to Vienna, where he had established a respected medical practice specializing in neurological disorders. Dr. Marcus Schroeder, confronted with the evidence from Millerton in February 1926, initially denied any connection to Kellerman after their university days, presenting himself as a reformed character who had abandoned youthful indiscretions. However, when presented with specific passages from the recovered letters that mentioned him by name and referenced shared experiences, he provided limited cooperation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. According to Schroeder, whose statement remained sealed in Austrian police archives but was summarized in American reports, the Brotherhood had been formed by 7 medical students interested in neurological research, who believed that scientific progress was being hampered by ethical constraints on experimental methodology. They had conducted unauthorized experiments on animals before gradually escalating to human subjects, initially using deceased persons obtained through grave robbery, but eventually turning to living subjects acquired through means Schroeder claimed ignorance of while displaying physical signs of extreme anxiety noted by the interviewing officers. When university authorities began investigating following an incident involving a missing groundskeeper's assistant, the group had disbanded, with members agreeing to continue their work independently in different locations. Schroeder claimed to have abandoned these activities after leaving university, a claim investigators found dubious given his continued correspondence with former associates, but admitted to exchanging letters with several former associates, including Kellerman, into the late 1872, before breaking contact due to concerns about Kellerman's increasingly erratic methodologies. He denied knowledge of Kellerman's activities in America, but confirmed that the group had maintained a coded communication system similar to that used in the recovered ledger, designed to discuss their research while avoiding detection by authorities. Most concerning was his statement that at least 3 other members of the original group had relocated to North America between 1875 and 1880, establishing themselves in widely separated locations to pursue their work without interference. The revelation that other members of the Brotherhood might be operating in North America prompted a comprehensive review of unsolved disappearances and unusual deaths throughout the country, coordinated through a specially formed task force that represented an early example of interstate police cooperation. Investigators compiled instances where circumstances bore similarities to the Millerton case, travelers vanishing from small communities without explanation, reports of unusual activities in isolated properties, discoveries of human remains showing evidence of surgical intervention, and individuals with medical knowledge who appeared suddenly in communities and departed under suspicious circumstances. These records, collected from over 30 states and territories and preserved in the National Archives, reveal the painstaking work of connecting seemingly unrelated incidents across vast geographic distances without the benefit of modern communication systems. Several cases emerged as potentially connected through timing, methodology, or trace evidence. In 1879, a physician named Heinrich Müller had practiced briefly in a small Pennsylvania town near Allentown before disappearing following questions about patients who died under his care, his medical instruments and personal effects abandoned, but all records of his treatments mysteriously removed. In 1881, a bookshop owner in Vermont named Thomas Pierce, known for his extensive collection of medical texts and fluency in German, fled when authorities began investigating the disappearance of several customers last seen entering his shop, leaving behind a locked basement room that contained chemical preparations similar to those found in Kellerman's laboratory. Most disturbing was the case of Dr. Elliot Richardson, a chemistry professor at a small college in upstate New York who committed suicide in 1884 when his private laboratory was discovered to contain human remains following a fire in an adjacent building, his journals revealing experimental protocols written in a cipher bearing striking similarities to Kellerman's code. While none of these cases could be definitively linked to Kellerman or his associates through concrete evidence, lacking the forensic techniques that would later revolutionize criminal investigation, the pattern suggested a disturbing possibility that what had been discovered in Millerton might represent just one node in a wider network of similar activities conducted by individuals with shared backgrounds, methodologies, and objectives. This theory gained additional support when investigators discovered that small personal advertisements in scientific periodicals between 1875 and 1885 contained messages in a simple substitution cipher, different from but conceptually similar to Kellerman's system, that appeared to reference experimental results and locations using terminology consistent with his journals. The darkness might be more widespread than initially feared, with individuals sharing Kellerman's perverted scientific interests, operating independently but with awareness of each other's work, a shadowy network of educated men whose respected positions within small communities provided perfect cover for activities too horrible for their neighbors to imagine. As the Millerton investigation expanded to consider these wider implications, a new development brought the case back to Missouri with chilling immediacy, shattering any hope that the horror had ended with Kellerman's disappearance decades earlier. In June 1925, authorities in Jefferson City received a letter addressed to Sheriff Robert Ealing, the envelope bearing the precise handwriting that had become familiar to investigators poring over ledgers and store records. The letter, postmarked from Chicago but with no return address, identified its author as Frederick Hauser, and directly referenced newspaper accounts of the discoveries at his former store. State police immediately forwarded the correspondence to Pike County, where it arrived like a ghost reaching through time to taunt those who sought justice for his victims. The writer expressed neither remorse nor concern about the investigation, but rather disappointment that his research materials had been disturbed before he could retrieve them, referring to the excavated remains as valuable specimens, representing years of systematic inquiry. Most troubling was his assertion that the work continues, now with greater understanding and purpose than was possible in the primitive conditions of rural Missouri. He claimed to have colleagues in 7 states pursuing related inquiries into the fundamental nature of consciousness and pain response, suggesting a network of like-minded individuals far more extensive than authorities had initially suspected. The letter concluded with a warning that attempts to interfere would be futile, as the Brotherhood operated beyond conventional understanding and without the moral constraints that blind ordinary men to deeper truths. Forensic analysis conducted by experts from Washington confirmed the letter's authenticity through detailed comparison of handwriting characteristics, paper composition, and linguistic patterns, indicating that Kellerman was indeed still alive as of 1925, 43 years after fleeing Millerton, and now approximately 75 years of age. This revelation transformed the investigation from a historical accounting of past horrors to an urgent manhunt for an active threat. An intensive search of Chicago, coordinated between federal agents and local police, yielded no trace of the man, though investigators discovered that a physician identifying himself as Dr. Anton Weber had rented rooms in the city briefly in early 1925. his landlady describing him as an elderly but remarkably vigorous German gentleman with impeccable manners who claimed to be conducting research at a local hospital. No record of his employment existed at any medical facility in the city, and the rooms had been vacated 2 days before the letter was postmarked, leaving behind only chemical residues that suggested the occupant had destroyed documents before departing. The darkness had surfaced momentarily, taunting those who sought to expose it, only to submerge once more into the anonymous landscape of urban America, leaving authorities to wonder where it might next emerge and what further horrors it might produce before being finally extinguished. The investigation took on new urgency following the Chicago letter, transforming from a local historical inquiry into a multi-state manhunt with implications for public safety across the nation. Federal authorities became formally involved in July 1925, coordinating efforts across multiple jurisdictions through newly established bureau protocols for interstate criminal activity. A specialized task force was assembled under the direction of Dr. Alexander Hamilton, a physician who had studied aberrant psychology in Europe and become an early pioneer in applying scientific principles to criminal investigation. Working from offices in the Chicago Federal Building, Hamilton developed a methodical approach for identifying potential locations where Kellerman or his associates might be operating, focusing on isolated communities with reports of unexplained disappearances, particularly those with educated newcomers who had established themselves in positions that provided both respectability and access to potential victims. The team compiled detailed maps showing patterns of unsolved missing persons cases, cross-referenced against locations of medical practitioners, pharmacists, or academics who had appeared in communities without verifiable backgrounds or who had received education in German institutions between 1870 and 1890. This systematic approach yielded its first significant results in September 1925, when investigations in the small Minnesota town of Lakeville revealed a physician named Frederick Muller, who had established a practice there in 1910, specializing in neurological conditions. Muller's background showed troubling inconsistencies when scrutinized, his claimed American medical credentials proving impossible to verify despite his apparent expertise. Surveillance of his isolated property revealed unusual patterns of activity, including late-night visitors who arrived by automobile from neighboring states approximately once per month. When authorities executed a search warrant, they discovered his house contained a hidden room beneath the detached garage, accessible only through a concealed entrance in what appeared to be a storage closet. This space, meticulously equipped with surgical implements and specialized equipment similar to that found in Millerton, contained evidence of recent use, including chemical preservatives and drainage systems designed to eliminate biological waste. When federal agents moved to arrest him following this discovery, Muller took his own life with a prussic acid capsule concealed in his watch, leaving behind extensive documents that confirmed his identity as Dieter Hoffmann, one of Kellerman's associates from Heidelberg and an original member of the Brotherhood. Muller's papers, many written in the same cipher system used in Kellerman's ledger, included correspondence with 3 other individuals identified only by code names, but with postmarks from locations in Wisconsin, Oregon, and Massachusetts. These communications, dated as recently as August 1925, revealed an organized network sharing research findings and methodologies while deliberately maintaining minimal personal contact to avoid detection. The darkness that had begun in the medical laboratories of Heidelberg had metastasized across America, operating in shadows for decades, while its practitioners presented respectable facades to their communities, and whether their victims dismissed as transients or runaways whose disappearances rarely generated sustained investigation. Using information from Muller's papers, authorities tracked the remaining members of the network throughout late 1925 and early 1926, a methodical pursuit conducted with unprecedented cooperation between local and federal agencies. The coded correspondence, once deciphered using the key developed during the Millerton investigation, revealed regular meeting locations, supply sources, and carefully oblique references to ongoing activities that investigators recognized as documenting human experimentation. Two more of Kellerman's associates were apprehended following months of surveillance and careful investigation. Walter Schmidt, practicing as a pharmacist in a small Oregon coastal town since 1891, maintained a reputation for charitable work with transient populations while concealing a basement laboratory accessible only through a mechanism disguised as a wine rack. Eric Voller, employed as a university librarian in Massachusetts specializing in rare medical texts, had constructed a hidden chamber behind the walls of his private study, the entrance concealed by a bookcase activated by a system of counterweights. Both locations contained evidence of activities similar to those uncovered in Millerton, including surgical instruments, chemical preservatives, and documentation suggesting decades of continuous operation. Both men, when confronted with overwhelming evidence, chose suicide over capture, leaving behind extensive records that further illuminated the network's activities. Kellerman himself remained elusive despite the mounting pressure, displaying a cunning that had allowed him to remain undetected for over 40 years. Evidence compiled from his captured associates suggested he had relocated repeatedly throughout his decades in America, never staying in one location for more than a few years and establishing new identities with each move. The task force compiled a chronology of his movements based on witness accounts, financial records, and documentation recovered from his associates. After fleeing Millerton in 1882, he had apparently spent time in a mining settlement in Colorado under the name Heinrich Weber, later appearing in San Francisco as Dr. Frederick Muller, before establishing himself in a small Wisconsin town as Professor Anton Richter, and finally moving to Chicago in the early 1900s using yet another identity. Each location showed reports of missing persons that aligned with his periods of residence, particularly cases involving individuals with unusual neurological conditions that might have interested him as research subjects. The final breakthrough came in March 1926, when a watchmaker in Detroit reported a customer who matched Kellerman's description from circulated photographs and had requested repairs to a unique pocket watch with distinctive engraving, one that had been identified in task force bulletins as belonging to Jonathan Miller, one of the Millerton victims. The watchmaker, having recognized both the man and the timepiece from police bulletins, notified authorities immediately after the customer departed. Surveillance was established within hours, leading investigators to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood where the man, now calling himself Edward Schaefer, presenting as a retired academic, had lived for approximately 2 years, establishing himself as a reclusive but unremarkable elderly gentleman whose neighbors described him as unfailingly polite but distant. The raid on Kellerman's Detroit residence occurred on the 17th of April, 1926, precisely 44 years after his disappearance from Millerton, a coincidence that struck investigators as deliberate rather than accidental. Federal agents and local police surrounded the modest 2-story house at dawn, approaching with the caution warranted by a man responsible for at least 20 confirmed deaths. Upon breaching the front entrance, authorities found the house empty but undisturbed, as if the occupant had stepped out momentarily rather than fled. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, still warm to the touch. A newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle showed entries in the same precise handwriting that had documented decades of horror. Evidence suggested Kellerman had fled just hours before their arrival, somehow alerted to their approach despite the operation's secrecy. The house appeared normal at first glance, containing the expected furnishings of a retired academic, bookshelves filled with medical texts in multiple languages, and a writing desk positioned to catch morning light through east-facing windows. It was only when agents moved a particular volume on German neuroanatomy that they discovered a mechanism revealing a concealed door leading to a hidden basement laboratory, similar to the one in Millerton, though no victims were found on the premises. This space, unlike the dusty cellar in Missouri, featured modern electrical equipment, precise surgical instruments, and an elaborate ventilation system. What they did discover throughout this clinical space was Kellerman's complete research archive, leather-bound journals, dating back to his time at Heidelberg, correspondence with his associates spanning decades, and detailed records of his activities in each location where he had lived under various identities. These materials, filling 16 crates when transported to Washington, provided the first complete picture of the man and his motivations, a psychological portrait more disturbing than investigators had anticipated. The journals revealed a mind of considerable intelligence utterly divorced from normal human empathy, viewing people as merely complex biological systems to be studied through dissection and experimentation without regard for their suffering or humanity. Most disturbing were Kellerman's notes on his ultimate research goal, what he termed the physical location of the human soul, a quest that had driven him across decades and continents. His early work had focused on conventional neuroanatomy, but over time had evolved into increasingly metaphysical inquiries about consciousness, pain thresholds, and the moment of death, documented with the same clinical precision, whether discussing surgical techniques or the expressions in his victims' eyes as life departed. In his later writings, dated as recently as March 1926, he expressed mounting frustration that despite decades of work and dozens of subjects, this central mystery continued to elude him, driving him to ever more elaborate and invasive procedures in his search. The darkness had been driven not by hatred or sadism, but by a perverted intellectual curiosity that recognized no ethical boundaries in its pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Anton Kellerman was never apprehended, despite an international manhunt that continued actively until 1932 and remained an open case file for decades afterward. He vanished completely after abandoning his Detroit residence, leaving behind only his meticulous records as testament to his decades of methodical horror. Unconfirmed reports placed him in South America, particularly in the remote regions of Argentina, where European expatriate communities absorbed many who sought anonymity in the aftermath of both world wars. Several accounts from the period mention a German-speaking physician of advanced age who conducted unusual research at a remote estate near Bariloche during the 1930 seconds. His visitors, including both local officials and European émigrés, who arrived under cover of darkness. Despite these tantalizing suggestions, no definitive evidence of Kellerman's ultimate fate was ever established, his final chapter remaining unwritten in official records. The wider investigation resulted in the identification of 7 confirmed members of the Brotherhood who had operated across the United States between 1875 and 1926. Their activities concentrated in small communities where their education and professional status provided both cover and access to victims. Collectively, their documented activities were linked to the deaths of at least 73 individuals whose remains were recovered or whose disappearances could be definitively connected to these men through physical evidence. The true toll was likely much higher, as many of their victims were travelers or transients whose disappearances went unreported or uninvestigated, their absences noted only by distant relatives who never learned their fates. The Millerton case and its subsequent unraveling had profound effects on American law enforcement, contributing to the development of more systematic approaches to investigating serial crimes and establishing the early foundations of criminal profiling. Dr. Hamilton's methodologies, developed during the Kellerman investigation, became influential texts in the emerging field of forensic psychology and the scientific study of deviant behavior. The case featured prominently in early FBI training materials as an example of organized criminal behavior operating across jurisdictional boundaries. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the case lies in what it revealed about human nature and the potential for darkness concealed beneath respectable exteriors. Frederick Hauser had been viewed by his neighbors as a reserved but respectable businessman, his methodical habits considered merely the eccentricities of a bachelor shopkeeper devoted to his trade. For 5 years he had operated in plain sight, serving customers, attending town functions, and maintaining meticulous records both of his business and his atrocities. His true nature, unsuspected by those who interacted with him daily, the burial ground behind his store, has long since been cleared and built over, modern structures erected without commemoration of what once transpired there. The town of Millerton has grown and changed with the passing decades, with few current residents aware of the horrors once concealed in their community. Yet in archives and case files, in the memories preserved in journals and newspaper accounts, the darkness remains a warning that evil often wears the most mundane of masks, and that the most macabre mysteries may lie not in remote castles or ancient crypts, but behind the unremarkable facades of our own communities, where monsters may live and work among us unrecognized.